evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be talking about the concept of two Americas and what that means. Who's one, who's the other, how many Americas are there? So our guest tonight is Professor Bill Barclay of the Chicago Political Economy Group. Bill, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think we can call each other Kevin and Bill. We've known each other long enough, and I've been on the show often enough, too. We should be able to do this.
We can dispense with Professor
Right.
Barclay.
That's right.
Yes.
So you mentioned the term Other America. And it's interesting because there was a book now 53 years ago written by that title by a man named Michael Harrington. And the book was very important in terms of defining a set of politics for a while. Harrington in 1962, the year I turned 18, I could buy beer, wrote a book.
And registered for the draft.
Wrote a book called The Other America, and it was a book about poverty in the United States. And that's what he was focused on. And it was at a time in 1962, if you can think back then, when people had a pretty rosy outlook about the U.S. Things had gone really well in the 16, 17 years since World War II. And there was
gotten through the Cuban Missile Crisis.
There was a sort of a burgeoning middle-income, middle-class group. So Harrington was trying to shake up the sort of universal political discourse by saying, well, wait a minute, there are a large number of people who actually aren't part of this prosperity that you keep talking about and that seems to define our country. And the story is that an aide to John Kennedy read the book and talked to Kennedy about it shortly before Kennedy was assassinated. And Lyndon Johnson, who was an old-fashioned Texas populist, picked it up and said, this is going to be, as they say nowadays, my legacy. I don't think they called it back then, but my legacy. I'm going to create a program to fight poverty in the United States called the War on Poverty.
So that came out of this book, The Other America.
Yes, it did.
So how did Harrington define it? I mean, was he really just looking at poverty, who's not getting a piece of the pie? And what did he discover about who wasn't?
Well, he was really looking at what we would call low-income people, because this is pre-Molly Orshansky's definition of poverty, which has become our official poverty measure.
And what is that definition now?
Well, she did it, and she never intended this to be the long-term thing. She did it based on a basket of goods, goods and services that people needed to have to survive. Harrington was really focusing on things. He looked at, for example, Appalachian migrants. He looked at African Americans in cities. He looked at people in the rural areas that were sort of away from any kind of industry, any kind of commerce. So he did it sort of by groups of people whose living standards were considerably less than the sort of popular image of the U.S. at that time. He didn't do it in a technical manner, which is much more common today, where you say, if you compare countries around the world, what proportion of the population, what proportion of households has an income less than half the median, which is a nice definition. It's not what Molly Orshansky's was, but it's a nice definition.
First was the basket of goods. Can you afford this basket of basic necessities, right?
Right. But the international definition now really used is this other version. But Harrington found, he also looked at old people, because old people were disproportionately poor then. That's
now, Social Security was in place, but still it was...
Medicare and Medicaid weren't in place. So yeah, Social Security was in place. It was gradually being expanded to cover more of the population. You know, when it was first put in, it didn't cover domestic workers, it didn't cover agricultural workers. Of course, it didn't and still doesn't cover a lot of public employees. But it was being expanded. But without Medicare and Medicaid, a lot of older people were poor. They were disproportionately poor.
So that was, the book was published in 1962, right? So this was data he had gathered up to probably 1960 or thereabouts. Right? So was this a shock? Was this a revelation to the politicians at the time? I mean, it must have come as something of a shock to Johnson if he decided to build his program around it. Why was this not widely recognized?
Why was poverty not widely recognized? Well, if you looked back to the Great Depression, and if you lived through the Great Depression and you lived through, and you're white, and you're in an urban area, particularly in the North and the West, less so in the South, and you lived through the Great Depression, and now you live in the middle of the late 1950s, people have cars, people are buying houses, people have washing machines in their houses, more and more people have running water. One of the things FDR did do in the New Deal is to extend power and running water to large parts of the country that didn't have it. So things looked really, they were different. I mean, there's no doubt they were different, and they looked pretty good. And there was this sort of celebration of the American way of life, the American dream. And the American dream was that, and I guess still is, that your sons and daughters will do better than you do economically. And that was
you'll have a car with big fins, and you'll have a house in the suburbs.
Right. Well, we went from a home ownership rate of something like 35% in the 1930 to over 60%. By the middle 50s. GI Bill, FHA mortgages, of course, which also implemented redlining. So there was the underside of this story of what the U.S. was that Harrington was interested in. He had worked in the some Catholic worker places in the central city and had seen some of this poverty, but I don't think even he understood the extent of its existence. So yeah, it was a shock. It made an impact on, clearly at least on Johnson and Kennedy. I'm not sure how much of an impact it made on, say, Johnson's opponent Goldwater in the '64 election, and I don't know how much impact it made on Kennedy's opponent in the '60 election, Nixon, although later in Nixon's actual presidency, he made a proposal for a guaranteed annual income. Nixon.
Well, actually, it's, as we've often heard, Richard Nixon could never be a Republican today because he was far too liberal.
Right.
But I would think even Jimmy Carter ran on a policy or on a platform of alleviating poverty and talking about, he would describe this, and I still remember his campaign ads just to show the age that you and I have both reached, about, he said, that's just shameful that we have this kind of discrepancy of lifestyle and income and wealth in America. So let's fast forward to today. So now it was 1962, we're now in 2015, almost 2016. And where are we today? How much progress have we made?
Well, if you look at a graph of the official poverty statistics, you find that in this, let's say 8 or 9 years after Johnson declared the war on poverty, the official poverty rate went down from something like 22 or 23% to about 10, 11%. And it's more or less stayed there a lot. And then 1987, in his campaign running for president, Ronald Reagan said, in the 1960s, we declared war on poverty and poverty won.
Which was not at all true.
Not at all true, but he sort of said, he said, we're going to throw in the white flag. We're going to surrender on this war of poverty. So the rate has drifted up. It's now right about 15%, 14.8%, I think, in 2014. And there's been some changes. Old people over age 65 are now much less likely to be poor than the population as a whole.
Because it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security.
Yes, so that's one thing. That's one thing that shows that you actually can deal with the questions of poverty. You can change it. Things that haven't changed, and in some respects gotten almost worse, is a portion of our children in poverty. And here I am looking at the notion of if a child is in a household where the income is less than half the median income, call that poverty. And that's 23 or 24 or 25% of the children in this country. That's a large number.
A quarter. Now,
close to between a fifth and a quarter.
So let's talk for a minute about the implications of that. If you have a quarter of the population of children in poverty, economically defined poverty, we've also seen that the idea of social mobility has declined dramatically in the United States over the last several decades.
And the reality has declined also. Not just the idea, the reality is
actually what I meant to say is the reality that social mobility is not nearly as available as it was seen. So if you have 25% of the children born into poverty, their chances of getting out of poverty would seem to be greatly diminished.
Low, yes, very low. And they are disproportionately likely to be in female-headed, single-parent female-headed families. And some people say, well, that's just the way it is. But again, if you look around the world, you find that other countries where you have a fair number of single-parent female-headed families, because of a system of a social safety net, tax and transfers, they are not more likely to be, their children of those families are not more likely to be in poverty than the country as a whole, where here they are. So you have, obviously, if you think of this in terms of race and ethnicity, African Americans are more likely to be poor than the Caucasian population, as are Hispanics. Now, we don't have good data on Hispanics before 1972 because we really weren't collecting it. For whatever reason, we're collecting it. And then if you say, let's look at African American families with a single parent female-headed, they're even much more likely to be in poverty. And Hispanic families, single parent female-headed, much more likely. There's been progress on all of them, but the numbers are still astoundingly high in terms of what proportion of people in those particular situations are in poverty, partly because and it's not because those mothers don't work. They very often do work. They very often work more than one job, but they're often in low-wage jobs. They are maybe in orderlies, health aides, personal care aides, fast food, waitresses, waiters,
retail.
Retail. All of those jobs that make up our service sector or make up a portion of our service sector pay well below the median wage. So if you have one parent in the family and that's where usually she is working, and you have kids, you're going to be in poverty.
So what does that portend for us as a society? If we're keeping 25% of the population in poverty, those kids never grow up to get out of it. What do we lose economically by having that high level of poverty?
Well, we certainly stunt their, as you said, their chances of getting ahead. And we know that having to struggle day to day to just survive, to get enough to feed your kids, to pay the rent, if the car breaks down, how you pay for that, that creates stress. And we know that stress is particularly hard on young kids in terms of how they behave, in terms of how they assess their world around them, and in terms of maybe their tendency to lash out at other people. So it has an immediate bad effect just on growing up. And then, of course, with a lower rate of social mobility and sort of closing off of access to some jobs at the higher up the level, you begin to recreate an economic underclass in a way that we thought we had ended coming out of the New Deal. We thought we had undone that.
So from a macroeconomic standpoint, having an underclass, it would seem to me that that's a significant drag on the economy as a whole, because you've got this large proportion of people who can't spend because they don't have money. And as economists, or you being an economist, want to say, my spending is your income and vice versa.
Right.
So if I have no money to spend, you get no income from me. So doesn't that huge level of poverty act as an anchor, a drag on overall gross domestic product?
It does act as a drag, but if I'm an entrepreneur, a business owner, I also like to know that I can fill a job anytime I want by paying a fairly low wage. So you have conflicting things going back and forth. But yeah, it certainly acts as that. You know, right now we're talking about a situation where I think the last estimate I saw was the top 5% of households by income account for almost a third of total consumption. So that skews total consumption in a certain ways, because certain goods are produced because they're to a level of people that can afford, and other goods are underproduced. So we have the Walmarts of the world, where many of these people in poverty may work, and where they also still qualify for various kinds of economic assistance because their wage levels are so low. So we, the rest of the population, may think of ourselves as, well, it's just them over there. But actually, we're helping. What companies like Walmart have done have shifted the cost, part of the cost of their lives, of those people's lifestyles, onto us.
Us as taxpayers.
Yeah, on us as taxpayers, right.
So what are some of the solutions? Creating more jobs is not necessarily the answer, because it depends on what type of job. And working with the constraints that you've just mentioned about employers with low wages, is the minimum wage part of that? There's much ado about $15 minimum wages across the country. Minimum wage finally indexed to inflation, so it keeps up. Are these some of the things that need to be looked at in order to try to address this problem?
Yes, definitely. If you look at states with higher minimum wage levels, they tend to have a lower level poverty rate. It's also true that states that have, individual states now that have lower degree of inequality have a lower poverty rate. So $15 minimum wage, by the time we get it, it's probably should be 20, but a $15 minimum wage would make a big difference. And it used to be the conventional economic wisdom that if you raise the minimum wage, you cut employment.
Jobs will leave.
There have now been enough studies of, for example, counties side by side across the state border, for one state raises the minimum wage or one county, the other one doesn't, to see that simply doesn't happen.
People don't leave. Businesses don't leave.
They don't pack up and leave, no.
Right.
I mean, the McDonald's, there are a lot of businesses that are geographically rooted in where they are, because that's where the customer base is. If they go somewhere else, they're not going to have that same customer base. So that's very important.
And I think that, if I stop you for there a second, because that's really important. We do see companies moving a lot, but these are not companies with minimum wage.
Right.
These are pharmaceutical companies,
automobile companies.
Automobile companies.
Yeah.
But the minimum wage worker is really focused on a tightly defined geographic location. Right?
It very often is, yes.
So the idea that they will pick up and leave is not reasonable.
No, it's not reasonable, and it's been now I think even relatively conservative economists are beginning to acknowledge that it really doesn't cut employment.
Yeah.
So obviously, increase the minimum wage. We need to really. I don't like this term "invest in the children," but that's what we need to do. We need to have, for example, pre-K, universal pre-K. We have about 45 or 47% of our kids under age 5 in pre-K nationally. Most of the countries that we think of ourselves as competing with, Germany, Japan, France, whatever, have over 75% of their kids there. And that Head Start, big H, big S, or
Right.
small h, s,
Right.
is very important in terms of those kids. Now, the other kind of policies that I think we need to implement, which again we're unique on, is we need to have paid maternity leave and paid paternity leave. We're the only country.
Why is that important, though?
We're the only wealthy country in the entire world that doesn't have mandated paid maternity, only wealthy country, mandated paid maternity leave. So women can know that they can leave the market, the job, and the job is still there when they come back. So they don't have to settle for they don't have to settle after 2 weeks after the kid is born to find the next low-wage job that I can go into and just do, and I can drop because if something happens to my kid, I have to take him or her to the hospital. I'll have to take some time off. I don't get sick leave. We don't guarantee sick leave. So now I go to the next low-wage job. It creates economic uncertainty. I'm going to make the pitch for paid paternity leave also, because I do believe that sharing childcare is very important. It's interesting if you look at the experience of the Nordic countries, they all began by implementing paid maternity leave, or paid family leave. But of course the mothers took it. And then, I think it happened in Sweden first, a conservative government said, well, no, we think both parents should do this. So we're going to say there's a certain number of weeks that if the father, not the husband necessarily, if the father doesn't take it, then the family loses it.
So they forced the father.
Well,
to,
you can decide to lose the leave.
yeah, but essentially,
yes,
that was a heavy hand.
yes, and that's been very important in terms of childcare and sharing the childcare burden in the household. And now a lot of other countries have adopted this. I would settle initially for us at least to have paid family leave.
Well, so what societal effect have they seen in these Nordic countries where this has been put in place? How do they see the society, the economy, crime rates? I mean, what metrics are being applied to this to see whether or not that makes any difference in societal welfare?
Well, you mentioned something a while ago about intergenerational social mobility. They have higher rates of social mobility than we do. That is and unfortunately all of this stuff is done on the male side. So I'm going to say the income ranking of the father is used to see how closely that predicts where the next generation ends up income-wise, and there's a much lower correlation in their case than there is in our case. So that's one thing that happens.
And can we attribute that to this paternity leave? Or
We can attribute that to the whole array of policies.
Okay.
Paternity leave, paternity leave. Some of these countries, by the way, do not have a minimum wage, but they feel that because they have high levels of unionization. I was in Norway and they said, we don't have a minimum wage. We think that by bargaining we can raise the wages of everybody.
Bargaining between whom?
Between employers and employees.
So collective bargaining.
Collective bargaining, what we call, yes. So that's something.
So a strong union movement would be part of this overall picture.
Yeah, there's a graph, I realize you don't have it here, but I have a nice graph of something I've done where it shows the share of income going to the top 1% graphed against the share of people in the union, and it crosses and diverges. And it crosses around the 1970s, mid to late 1970s, and then diverges. Fewer and fewer people in unions, more and more share of income going to the top, particularly the top 1%.
Well, and that's not, as I'm sure you know, that's not by accident that the unions have been targeted
Right.
For many years as being evil, and some of them were.
Some of them have been, yes.
Yeah. So we've got social programs, paternity leave, maternity leave,
Minimum wages.
minimum wage, strong union movements. How do you make some of this stuff start to happen, particularly unionization? That's been on the decline for decades in the U.S. How do you turn that around? What kind of policies would help turn that around?
Well, policies that without regard to whether we think they're going to be implemented anytime soon. Is that what okay.
Yes.
Okay. So you need a national labor. You need a return to the question of the Wagner Act and what it covered and what it didn't cover.
What was the Wagner Act?
It was the one that originally created the National Labor Relations Board. So what we have now is more and more companies are trying to classify their workers as independent contractors, so which makes you really can't organize them, and the company is not responsible for their health care. And there is a case, I think it just went before the NLRB, around McDonald's and whether the McDonald's workers are actually independent contractors.
Yeah, and they ruled that they were not, in
Right.
fact, independent contractors.
Right. But that's really the first move in that direction that's happened for a while. So we need to, you can't, I'm not saying everybody has to join a union, but I am saying that people need to have a more voice in their workplace.
Well, and I am not being an economist, but I have read enough that once unions have reached a particular critical mass, all wages begin to rise.
Yes, they
even
do.
the non-unionized jobs, because of this, the pull effect of wages. So you're right, it would not be necessary for everyone to join
No.
a union, but a stronger movement would create more. Now, why is it though that unions have become so unpopular? Well, we know that there's been a concerted effort to try to destroy them, but even the people who might be unionized seem to be turning against unions.
Well, actually, the union favorability has grown in terms of polls that are taken of the country nationally. But you saw what happened, 2 years ago when UAW tried to organize a VW plant in Tennessee.
And lost, right?
Yes, and lost. The Tennessee congressman came out against urging people to vote against the union,
Right.
which is something you probably wouldn't have seen 30 or 40 years ago.
Congress would have stayed out.
They
Not
would have recognized it was somebody else's concern.
Right.
So minimum wage, social policies, we do, and the pre-K, and then we need to address the question of our tax structure. We have,
Just going to ask you, how do we pay for all this?
yes, we have a tax structure that favors capital income over labor income. That is, income from dividends, interest, capital gains is taxed at a lower rate than income from wages. And the argument for that had been that, well, you need to provide incentives for people to invest. And
Well, also that it's double taxation if you tax it, because the corporations theoretically are taxed, and then the earnings from those dividends or capital gains come to me as an investor, but those earnings have already been taxed at the corporate level, so if you tax me, then you're double taxing that income.
But we're pretty unusual in this in terms of investment in this way. What you're saying is that, hey, labor, really, who cares? Your income really doesn't count for very much. We tax you at a higher rate. So we need to change that, and there are some obvious loopholes. We read every year about the carried interest break that hedge fund managers get, which adds to a whole lot. It's significant. But probably even more significant, which I think we'll just begin to understand, is the amount of wealth that is stored offshore. Zuckman just came out with a book that estimates that about 8% of it's either 8% of global wealth or 8% of U.S. share of global wealth is actually offshore, and therefore it's away. You can't touch it. You can't touch it. You can't get at it. And we need to stop that because it's real. It's there. It's earned. We should tax it.
Now, once again, though, that it could be taxed in the country in which it's earned, like with the argument about corporate taxes that are, if they're legitimately earned overseas. I know there's lots of tax shifting going on, but if it's legitimately taxed overseas or earned overseas, it could be subject to tax in the local country, and then when repatriated, taxed again here. So
except you get to deduct taxes that you paid abroad. But I'm talking about, I'm not talking about money that's sitting in Germany or France. I'm talking about money that's sitting in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Jersey.
Havens.
Yes,
Right.
the tax havens. But that's what his book is about. So we need to address that. Now, one of the questions about how to pay for some of these things, which we should have, that I think raises a very important issue, is why don't we tax the huge amount of trading of financial assets that occurs in this country? You know, the financial sector, and I worked in the financial sector for 23 years. You know that. I don't just trash the financial sector. I made my living there. But the financial sector in this country has gone from about 2.3% of GDP in 1960 to over 8% today.
almost 3 times.
Almost 3 times. And think about this for a minute. Finance doesn't make anything that you can touch, see, or taste, right?
Right.
Finance is really a utility, and it used to be a utility. It's a utility in the same sense that water is a utility. Water allows you to do something, be clean, take a bath, wash your clothes, whatever. Finance should be a utility that allows money to flow into where you need to have to invest it. But what's happened, and there's been some interesting studies, what's happened is that the financial sector has taken an increasing cut of that. So a guy named Thomas Philippon, who's out of NYU, done some studies which shows our financial sector today is actually less efficient than it was during the time of J.P. Morgan.
Using what metric?
The metric is how much money leaks out, in a sense, to the finance sector for every $1 of investment capital raised. And it's a higher amount today than it was.
Well, it would have to be if the percent of GDP has
Right.
increased so dramatically.
Right.
That money's going to the financial sector,
Yes.
which means it's not being allocated out to the investment community that needs it to build businesses or
Right.
to fund expansion, whatever they would normally do.
And employees in the financial sector, at the top of the financial sector, are significantly overrepresented, for example, in the top 1% of the income population. So if we tax the trading, because part of finance is more efficient. You know, it does. Can you remember when you had to wait a week for your check to clear when you checked to the bank?
Oh, yes,
right?
yes.
Or even 10 days. That doesn't happen anymore. That is more efficient. So the cost of doing those kinds, just using finance as a system of payments has gone down, but the cost of trading and the amount of trading has gone up tremendously. A very simple
Trading of stocks, bonds, securities.
Stocks, bonds, any kind of financial assets. And you know, in 1975, the average holding period for a share of stock was 4 years. Today, the average holding period is less than 1 year. And of course, you're talking about certain types of trading that you and I were discussing before the show, high frequency trading, the average period is like measured in nanoseconds, yes. And we laugh at this, but it also drains resources that could go elsewhere, because particularly financial firms that do a lot of trading are interested in building very sophisticated computer algorithms, and they're interested in hiring the people, our young people out of engineering schools or computer schools.
The best and the brightest.
The best and the brightest to do this. And that may be very good for the firm, may provide a good living for the individual, but you think, what else could those individuals be doing in this society in the sense of maybe working on a cure for cancer or some other kinds of medical things if they weren't being grabbed up by those firms?
Well, the counter-argument to that would be, of course, that people should be able to use their skills to make as much money as they want to make with that set of skills, and that no one's forcing these computer programmers to earn $1 million a year writing high-frequency trading code, but they do it anyway.
And that's why you need a progressive taxation system. Let people earn as much as they want. And just like under our last socialist president, Dwight David Eisenhower, we can tax them at 91% on the top level. You know, there was a 91% tax rate on income over $400,000 at hit time, which is roughly $3.2 million today. It's a fair amount of income that you could still have.
A pretty comfortable lifestyle on $3.2 million.
So. Yes, right.
In fact, I saw Bernie Sanders in one of his speeches. In fact, one of the debates said that he pointed out that Dwight Eisenhower was more socialist than he himself was.
That's true. I really like Sanders. And he, by the way, has a piece of legislation that he's put forward in the Senate, which calls for exactly this kind of financial transaction tax. And I should be fair to note that Martin O'Malley seems to support the same thing. Clinton's approach is very different in that regard.
So the tax would be on any kind of financial transaction. So if I trade a share of stock, there's some tiny fraction of a cent that will be charged on each share, correct? But the overall effect of that, given the number of shares that are traded every day, theoretically would be significant.
You could, a representative from northern Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has had a bill at the House level for some years that calls for this. And he wants to tax only the buy side. So you buy stock today and you pay the tax. 5 years from now you sell it, you don't pay any tax. So he wants to tax only the buy side, and the estimates he'd raise around $350 billion a year.
$350 billion.
This is on stocks, bonds, and derivatives.
Yeah, not talking about selling real estate or any of the other transactions that happen.
Not when you take money out of a bank account, not when you decide I want to get pesos so I can visit Mexico, or euros so I can visit France. And those are not included in all of this.
Well, as fascinating as that is, we have to save that for another show.
Okay.
And so, Bill, since you are in fact a regular on the show, we'll have you back and we'll talk about high-frequency trading and what that means.
That would be very good.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks for being on the show one more time, and thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. We've been visiting with Bill Barclay of the Chicago Economic
Political
Economy Group. Thank you. I should know that by now. You're watching Public Perspective, so Bill and me, your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find at least me every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can find us, including this show, on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night. All right, so stay seated as always.